Okay. So I hope I'm doing that right, and if not, someone will teach me how to do it before next week. So, very nice to see you guys, and we'll go around in a second and introduce ourselves because I think there's folks here who may not know each other. So really a pleasure to have you all here. I am jet lagged, but this is the right time of day actually because it's like 8 o'clock at night for me right now. So I'm working on it. It was an amazing journey actually.
By the way, Rabbi Ike, Michelle and Michael really, really enjoyed their Israeli experience. I was so happy they were there.
Yeah, it was so nice to have them on the trip, and of course made me think of when you were on the trip.
Yes, me too. Me too. Right.
To be able to travel to Israel with you and then with your children.
Yes, how nice. Yes.
So so we had a wonderful trip from the congregation, 23 people in Israel, and we backed that up to the Central Conference of American Rabbis, just had their annual meeting, which every 7 years is in Israel. So I stayed longer. Cantor Jay, who came on the trip, also stayed longer, but he was having fun for a few days in Israel with people, and then we met up again at the airport and came back on the same flight, actually. So and it's so nice to have a partner like Rabbi Evan, who was here for 3 weeks while Cantor Jay and I were in Israel. So I have to say, my 25 years in Highland Park, this was the longest I've been away from the congregation in one stretch, was these 3 weeks. And I felt comfortable doing that because I knew there was someone here, taking care of the store, so to speak. And
Rabbi, was everybody on the trip just first timers to Israel?
There were a few people who'd been before, but most of those people hadn't been in so many years that it really was like a first time trip for them. And we had somebody say, "Oh, I've been to Israel before." Yeah, it was 50 years ago. All right. Okay. Yeah. So technically, this is a second time trip for you. None of what so if they could even remember what they saw 50 years ago, it wasn't what we saw this time. Right?
So you explored all kinds of different areas.
Different
experiences.
Yeah, we went to different places in Israel, and certainly one of the goals when you organize a trip like this is to try and connect in a lot of different modalities, right? And it was on the last night of the trip, we go around, we were sitting at a table like we're sitting here, and we asked people to say what was a moment where they felt most connected. And I could not possibly predict what that moment would be, right? Because people just react to different kinds of sensory experiences in very different ways. Well, so for some people, the moment that was most connecting was we spent an hour picking kohlrabi in a field, and that it's for an organization that actually gathers up all of the kind of extra food from hotels and things around Israel and gets them to the people who are food insecure. But they also have this farmland that a farmer has essentially donated for their use, and so they grow crops and do the same thing. So we got to be labor for an hour picking kohlrabi, which will be on somebody's dinner table 2 days later, right? So but I think they said that they get food to 250,000 people every week in Israel.
Every week?
A week. Yeah, extraordinary. But anyway, so for at least one person on our trip, the feeling of actually having their hands in Israeli dirt, that was the high point of the 10 days for them. For others, it's places that you might expect a little more, the Western Wall or Yad Vashem, but for at least one person on our trip, it was Machane Yehuda. I don't know if you're familiar with Machane Yehuda. It's the Jewish market in Israel, just a big open air market. And we went there on a Tuesday afternoon. And for someone on the trip, it was just that sort of bustling feeling of everybody out doing their grocery shopping was like, it made Israel alive in a way that when you visit Masada, I mean, that's history, but it's not exactly alive in the same sense, I think, if I can paraphrase what he was saying about what it did for him.
Can't wait for the next trip, so I think.
2 years from now, we're already thinking about it, 2025, probably at one of the school vacations, because we'll probably try to bring some, we have the biggest class in our Lev learning program is actually would be coming of age for their B mitzvah services that year in 2025. There's something like 60 kids in that class, and so being able to take a few of them to Israel to have their B mitzvah service together in Jerusalem would be a wonderful thing. It would also relieve some of the pressure on the schedule here if we can get some of them there, and it just seems like an opportunity. So it'll probably be either at spring break or right at the beginning of the summer, but we haven't set the exact dates yet, but that's what we're looking for. And I got to say, this experience was all adults because it was during school time, so no families with kids could come. But I'd say the experience that adults have when we have kids on is an amazing experience for people. You know, I know people sometimes have said, "Oh, I don't really want to go when there's going to be kids. It's going to," and then at the end of the time when we say what was the most meaningful thing, they said, well, the bar mitzvah service at the Western Wall. I mean, that was clearly the most meaningful thing, you know, for the older adults too. So, and then the rabbinic conference was extraordinary. You know, I'm sure a lot of you were tuned into some of the things that are going on in Israel right now. It governmentally speaking, it's a pretty dark time, but every day, both with our group and then with the rabbis, I mean, I was with people who are doing everything they can to make good things happen there, you know, to make sure that hungry people are fed, to make sure that LGBTQ people's rights are not abrogated, that Reform Judaism continues to grow and prosper in Israel, you know, that all minorities are protected as the Declaration of Independence of Israel envisions that everyone's rights in Israel will be protected. And there are some real challenges, just like there are real challenges in our country, you know. So, but being there and seeing people every day working to make things better, it's a very powerful experience. So this isn't really a class about Israel, but I can see there might be a question or two around the table. Yeah.
Of course, I'm thinking of what they did in terms of the environment, how the conference was, and yeah, that's usually ignored. Decent,
but not great. You know, say I'm there's always room for improvement, as you know, right? So yeah, I'd say just on that simple level that you and I have talked about many times, a lot more people carrying their own water bottles than getting the water bottles off the bus. Because in Israel, you know, when you visit some places, I mean, we went to Morocco together, right? And, you know, you can't drink the water. In Israel, you can drink the water, right? So there's no need for those one-time use water bottles. And a lot of people seem to, you know, have internalized that message much, much more. So that's a positive. In terms of the, there are, this particular conference doesn't serve a lot of big group meals and things like that, but the food waste thing was probably the biggest issue, right? Like I went out on a field trip, you know, where a Palestinian woman from Silwan catered the lunch, and there were 25 of us, and we had lunch for 100, you know. So the good news is that there is an organization like Leket that collects this stuff, but I don't know how much they got from our conference, you know. So
I think the important thing is that the conference takes away a message about it.
Yeah.
That's what I would.
So the conference, you know, every day we do some, you know, I'd say I was with 25 people at this particular event because there were 10 other events with 25 people going on in different parts of the country at the same time. So there isn't a lot that we do all together. So some tracts actually really talked about environmentalism in Israel and some of the things that Israel's doing. I mean, Israel recycles 79% of its water. The next best country in the world, I think, is Spain, which recycles 19% of its water. So there were messages there to be had, but not generally for the whole group at any one time, because the whole group was hardly ever together for any one time, but so there's room for improvement as always, but some, I would say, it was better than it was 7 years ago when the last time we did that conference in Israel.
Exporting any of these technologies.
Absolutely.
Because I mean,
Yeah.
California could use it.
Right.
I mean, there's so many places that could use their technology.
Yeah, so they are exporting that stuff. They're also doing a lot with desalination, which has ups and downs, although there's this project which I hope will not get scuttled. But Jordan is building a solar farm which will power a desalination plant in Israel, which will replenish the Jordan Valley, starting with the Lake Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, which actually is at the highest level it's been in years, partly because of desalination, partly because of some good rainy seasons. So they're actually starting to ask the question about whether they can open the dams and refill the Jordan, which will be great for farmers in both Jordan and Israel, and occupied territories and wherever. I mean, this river needs to be restored. So there's some good stuff going on, and hopefully it will.
We're doing better than the west part of our country.
Oh yeah, I think so. But, anyhow, but we're here to talk about the Prophet of the Andes, and talking about Israel does sort of play into it a bit, because not to get too far ahead in the story, because I do want to talk about it sort of in 4 parts over our 4 weeks. So today is really the first 60 pages. So if you read only the first 60 pages, you wouldn't know what the connection to Israel is going to be, but I can assure you it's going to be there as we go farther. Some of you I know have read the whole book already. There may be some people online or here who haven't read any of it yet. That's okay. I'm going to talk exclusively about the first 60 pages, 61 pages today. And then for next time, if you want to read along with us, we'll go to what's the page number? Page 128 for next time. You may have noticed that there are no chapters in this book, but there are breaking points, and they conveniently seem to come every 60 pages or so. So it works out pretty well for what we're doing. But so for next week, if you haven't read it all, try to read up to about page 128. This is, I think you'll find it a really interesting story, really well researched and documented. There's a lot of notes in the back, so you can check on some of her resources and things like that. Graciela Mochkofskyby, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that 100% right, is from Argentina. She has been an Argentinian journalist. She lives in New York City today. She is a professor at City University of New York, and runs a Spanish language journalism program there, where the idea is to train bilingual journalists, particularly people who might want to do either journalism in the United States on Spanish language stations, or reporting on places that speak Spanish around the world. So she got her start in Argentina. She writes in Spanish. This book is translated by Lisa Dillman. So she, even though she's in America and teaching in 2 languages, I think at City University, she still wrote the book in Spanish, and it's translated. I have not looked at it in Spanish. My Spanish is not good enough to do a side-by-side comparison, so I have to trust people who've said it's a really good translation of what she set out to do. Her own background is that she has a parent who is Jewish and one who is not, and and yet she grew up in Argentina with a name that said Jewish to people.
Yes.
So I'm at least that's her perception of it, but I think it certainly shows. I mean, we would see it too, Mochkofsky, and think from Eastern European descent of some kind, right, Polish or something like that, wouldn't necessarily say to us Jewish, but in terms of immigration into Argentina, I think names like that do often signal Jews there, because there wasn't so much immigration of other types of Eastern Europeans, right? I mean, I don't think they have a big, Slavic population that came at any particular point. So she was born in 1969, so which means that she was a little girl in some of the dark times of Argentinian history. The dirty war there, the story, in great anti-Semitism in Argentina in those days in particular. She's written about some of this, and we'll maybe go on a digression about it in a little bit. But so while I don't think she really identifies herself as being particularly Jewish, she has written a lot about the Jewish experience in Argentina. She wrote a whole book about Jacobo Timmerman, whose name you might remember. But he was a Jewish Zionist Argentinian journalist who, right, he wrote a famous book about his arrest and incarceration and torture during the Dirty War, right? And then he when he was released, he actually went to Israel, and then he started writing exposés about Israel, right? So he actually, in some ways, found himself as a man without a country in a lot of ways. He went. His story is a fascinating story. His own book about it. I don't think her book has been translated into English, but I could be wrong. But people say it's a terrific piece of journalism about Jacobo Timmerman. So I never got a chance to meet him, but after he was released, after he spent some time in Israel and then some time in New York, he went back to Argentina. And he testified before this commission that was investigating it was called the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons. And one of the co-chairs of that commission was actually a rabbi, a guy named Marshall Meyer, an Argentinian rabbi who I met when I was a student in New York in 1986. So he's a very... he came to New York, and he kind of took a small, sleepy congregation on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and turned it into the place you wanted to be on Shabbat in Manhattan in the late 80s. It was called B'nai Yeshurun, BJ for short. And he brought this Argentinian music thing. You would love it. The music was just it has been amazing for years, and for years and years I would take groups to, so I went there as a student, and then whenever I had a free Shabbat, which was not that often because they sent us out to little congregations that couldn't afford rabbis, but that would be my place of choice to go to. And Rabbi Meyer, and then actually they've had a series of Argentinian rabbis at this congregation since then, to keep that musical tradition alive. So it's actually a very cool place. But so she wrote about Jacobo Timmerman and his life and all of this in one of her previous books. I think she's written 6 books. She writes numerous articles. I mean, if you look her up now, the first things that come up are about Argentina and the World Cup, and some of those kinds of things. I guess there's an Argentinian movie that's been nominated for the Oscar for best foreign film, so she's got an article about that.
1985, I think it's called.
1985 is the name of the movie. Yeah,
That's the story
Yeah.
guy that you're talking about.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'll have to watch it now.
Very
No.
interesting movie.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So it's about Jacobo Timmerman
It's about the whole trials that went on.
after the
People
Dirty
superior
War and
all
okay.
of that.
It's interesting. Yeah, because by 85, Timmerman had been out of Argentina, lived in Israel and New York, and had come back to Argentina. I think he died in Chile, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, he had a heart attack
The
in
story
Chile.
was focused on the public servant who was the district attorney or something
Mhm.
of the time.
Okay.
Who, when democracy came, they thought would do absolutely nothing
Uh-huh.
and that nobody would work for him. And it's the story of how he started to prosecute all these people,
Oh.
which they never thought was going to be
Cool.
prosecuted.
I will definitely have to watch this movie. Just curious, those of you who are online, when someone else talks in the room, could you hear them at all?
Yes.
A little bit.
Okay,
Little bit.
great.
Be a little louder.
Okay, so when we talk in here, if we can speak up, and maybe we'll see. This is sort of a test run in terms of this kind of being in two places at once sort of thing. We'll see how it goes. So what else can I tell you about Graciela Mochkofskyby that you don't know? So, she wrote for a Página 12, page 12, a kind of a magazine newspaper in Argentina that was sort of a famous sort of watchdog journalism. She wrote opinion pieces for them as well. She wrote for La Nación, which is the oldest paper in Argentina. She wrote for El País from Spain, The Nation, so she was a columnist for them as well. So she's really got a very remarkable background. She tells the story. I think she tells it a little bit at the beginning of the book, if I remember correctly, about how she came upon this story, which was that she was just looking for a project, kind of, and she on the internet came across this short article, essentially a fundraising letter from a rabbi from Muncie, New York, which is, you may know, an Orthodox Hasidic community primarily in New York State. And this rabbi was looking for funds to support the conversion of, as he put it, Peruvian Indians to Judaism, right? And that's where she first heard about this story. And then, being a good journalist, there was a phone number at the end of the thing for more information. So she called the number, right? And she was speaking to a member of this community that is just getting started, kind of in our first 60 pages. And so she ended up traveling to Israel, to Peru, multiple times over the years to meet with members of this community. So in our starting pages, our first 60 pages, the community is just starting to come into existence. And so if we can just sort of put our minds into just those first 60 pages, right? There's this is a little bit like what we do at Torah study every week. We know what happens next, right? But we focus on what we're looking at right at the moment, right? So we have this story about this one particular guy in this one particular place. He's not, Indian is not the right word for what he is. I mean, technically, I think the term is mestizo. It's someone who is descended from both native tradition in Peru and also from the Spanish conquistadors who came and conquered. So I guess maybe akin to what we might call mixed race today or something like that. But his story is a remarkable thing. I was thinking as I was reading this, how many movies start with that phrase, based on true events, right? And why do movies begin that way? You know, what's the reason they put up that thing that it, you know, first of all, they say based on, because they don't want you to think it's absolutely true, right? That they haven't changed some things. But why do they want us to know that something is based on a true story?
Makes it more interesting, I think.
Yeah.
That it's not from somebody's imagination.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It makes it more interesting. It's not from someone's imagination. I'd say that some of you know that before I was a rabbi, my undergraduate degree is in radio, television, and film. I actually wrote screenplays when I was in college,
Wow.
right? And one of the things I remember my professors saying regularly was, just because something happens in real life doesn't make it realistic. Yeah, right? If somebody wrote this and said, I just read this great novel about the prophet of the Andes, we would all say, that's crazy. You know, this is impossible, right? The idea that some mestizo in Peru ends up, you know, and I don't want to get past the 60 pages, right? But ends up where this guy and the other people in this book end up. That's the most ridiculous story I've ever heard. I want nothing to do with that.
So it gives it some credibility.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just some credibility. It really happened, right? It's completely not realistic, right? Yeah.
Gonna say that too.
I'm sorry, what?
Life is stranger than
It is, right? I'm the
There's some stories that people tell you their stories, you say, my God, that would make a great movie. Yeah.
right. Well, and you know, and maybe it would make a great movie, maybe not. It's so unbelievable, right? You know, where does this start? This starts from this weird story to begin with, right? An almost fable story, right? That his father is murdered by someone he knows. You know, and our protagonist wants nothing more than revenge. And it's just by happenstance that the one thing that's left from his father's memory is this trunk. And he opens up the trunk, and among the things he finds inside it is a Bible. A Bible translated into Spanish. So Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible, right, in one volume, and he starts to read it. Yeah.
Don't they feel today, with a lot of fiction that I've been reading,
Yeah.
that a lot of the influences to all these lands that the Spaniards overtook will have a lot of Jewish influence in them, because a lot of people who came over with the Spaniards were really looking for someplace to go.
Yeah, there are some certainly some articles about this, and a lot of things that when Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, you know, they had to leave, and where did they go? And so you know, there's some really good scholarly work on this. There's a fair amount of conjecture about it. Right? For instance, Christopher Columbus's voyage. One thing that makes his voyage unique is that there were no priests on his boats.
That's interesting.
No one knows why, right? Well, we think we know, right? We think we know. You know, but that it's interesting, because all these other Spanish conquistadors, when they went out, they brought priests with them, and part of what their intention was to go and convert all of these people that they met. I don't have a lot of deep understanding about Argentina, but I've traveled some in Mexico. And one of the interesting things in Mexico, I don't know if anyone's been to the city Puebla in Mexico. So the Spanish conquerors came, they forced the natives to build 365 churches in Puebla, one for every day of the year, was the idea. And the indigenous people did what they were forced to do, but that didn't necessarily mean that they had adopted the faith that is forced on them by the conquistadors. So you can go into some of those churches that they built and find, sort of hidden in their architecture, all of the native gods and goddesses of Mexico, right? So this intermingling of culture happens all over South America and Central America, right? So that the Spanish Catholicism comes in, but there is still this undercurrent of other religious traditions sort of mixed into it, right?
Well, one of the biggest misconceptions
Mhm.
that especially Americans have about South America,
Yeah.
and I speak from actually being in South America.
Okay.
I'll get to that in a second.
Yeah.
Is that South Americans are Mexican.
Mhm. Yeah.
South America was conquered, traveled by Spanish, Portuguese, and other people.
Mhm.
My experience with that starts in 1987, when my wife and I adopted a little girl who is now 35 years old.
Wow.
From Paraguay.
Okay.
And while in Paraguay, we were walking through the whole thing with, stuff that we had to do to get her visa and all of that. And one of the interesting things that happened is that my daughter's birth certificate reads Judith Fisher Barr.
Okay.
From the Spanish, which is Judith being the name that they gave her.
Uh-huh.
Because the only thing they knew about us as an adopted family was that we were Jewish.
Okay.
So to them,
right.
And then Fisher Bar.
The Hebrew is Yehudit,
Right.
I mean, right from the
Fisher
Yehuda,
Bar
which is the word that gives us
So-
Jew.
As we had time walking around and everything else, we happened to walk into this one store. And there was a little picture on the store. Were you down in Paraguay?
I adopted my son.
Are you Fisher?
No, no, but we had a similar experience going back.
Were you in Paraguay? Because my wife,
Yeah,
because there's
yeah.
somebody who was a member of the synagogue that my wife met.
No. But my son is 29 years old. and
Paraguayan.
Paraguayan.
Okay, and so we walked into this one little store,
Yeah.
and we were kind of walking around, and there was a picture on the register that it's the parent, the owner's son was in Israel. You ran into the same.
We went into a store and there was a lot of Judaica.
Yeah, this was just the normal.
Yeah, but no, there was a lot of Judaica.
Were you in Ascension?
And connected with the Jewish community.
Yeah.
We did our birthright trip back to Paraguay when my son was about 12, 13, and connected. And that was the first store we went into and got connected with the Jewish community. So
This my daughter was
older.
Well, she was 2 years old. This is when we picked her up.
right.
But we walk into the store and there's this little sign and started talking to the owner. And she's telling me there's this Jewish community.
Yeah.
It dates back to, prior to World War II, that there were people from Eastern Europe and everybody else. And there was this small synagogue. And if we wanted to come to services, we could come to services. But they were whole nother story. They were trying to get us out of the country because of my daughter. And we actually, if you adopted, how long were you there?
So we went twice for the adoption process and then came back 12 years after. So we were there.
How long were you there for the adopted?
We were there about a week each time, but there were members of our group that it was like the last opportunity to get people
We were
out.
there for 4.5 days. And it's only because there was a national holiday.
Right.
The word on my daughter was, she was and I'm using old terms, the illegitimate child of a politician or a wealthy person,
Right.
and they wanted her the hell out of the country.
Right.
So all of a sudden, from that, we sort of learned
Right.
that the Jewish community within Paraguay, and the Jewish community throughout South America dates back way before World War II, when everybody thinks all the
Right.
Germans or anybody else
right.
were coming.
Right.
So it gave us this whole different perspective
Right.
on this kind of
Sure.
story.
Right.
And so you have both, of course. I mean,
Right.
so we do, you know, my brother-in-law is from Argentina, and his family came in the early 1930s, right? So there were those Jews as well. But there are, you know, so do they go all the way back to the time of Columbus? And so, well, you know, there's no question. The first Jews in America, you probably know, came from Brazil, right? By way of Amsterdam, right? So they were Portuguese Jews who had been expelled from Spain through Portugal to Amsterdam to Brazil, where they spoke Portuguese, and so they were living in Recife, and 23 of them came to Manhattan in 16 whatever.
And the rest of them went to Savannah, Georgia and started.
Right. Yeah.
I would like to say something about Argentina. My experience with Argentina goes back to 1912. And before that, there was a family there.
Mhm.
So my mother-in-law was born in Argentina.
Mhm.
Her parents were on a ship going to Argentina from Eastern Europe because they already had families settled in Argentina in business. And her father he opened a business there, and she was born there. And then 2 years later, he had a business in Montevideo because her sister was born there before they got on the ship to come to New York. So it was like a stopover with family and business to get, and that was in
Well,
1912.
the interesting thing is
Right.
when we went to Paraguay and checked into our hotel.
Yeah.
If I would put up a picture of the person that checked us in from the hotel and said to you, identify the nationality of this individual.
Mhm.
And without a picture, I will describe it. Pale white, the reddest hair you could ever see, and freckles everywhere. This was a Paraguayan,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
because South America was settled by Europeans.
Right.
Central America. We came from New Mexico 6 months ago,
Uh-huh.
and the first time the conquistadors came up from Mexico City and founded Santa Fe, it was just the conquistadors, the friars, no settlers. The second wave, 50 years later, they brought 100 settler families. And it was like you said, why would anybody come from Spain to what was then Mexico, and then even worse, go up to what became New Mexico,
Right.
the wilds? The wife of the first governor of that area, it was a Spanish name, but for what they call New Spain, brought with him his sister and his sister's big family.
Mhm.
In the early 1600s, the sister is burned at the stake by the Inquisition in Mexico City as a secretly practicing Jew.
Yeah.
And they think about half those families probably were Jews from Spain
Right.
and Portugal.
Yeah. So,
The DNA is there.
so all of this is fascinating, and not this guy's story, right? Do you know what I mean? So we do have, you know, sort of 500 years of Jewish experience in South America and Central America. Each country is going to be a little bit different in terms of that. I mean, what the patterns of immigration and migration were and all those things. But in none of those things does this guy, you know, fall into that, right? He is not the descendant of conversos, you know, of secret Jews who, you know, he's not claiming any sort of heritage that, oh, once upon a time we were Jews, right? He comes at this from a completely different place. Yeah.
One of the things that amazed me about him.
Yeah.
And the beginning of this book, and when you talk about what he found in the trunk, and he found the Bible, the fact that he actually put that Bible, the Old and New Testament, and read it from beginning to end and studied it, which it's not easy reading.
No.
In any language.
Right.
It's not easy. It's not like you're in great reading this interesting novel and what's going to happen next.
Right.
But he had the foresight and the interest to me, this was an amazing person.
Yeah, yeah, it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, there's a reason the book is called The Prophet
Yes.
of the Andes, right? You know, the idea that you would pick up the Bible and somehow, I've known a lot of people over the years who say, I'm going to read the whole Bible. And sometimes they actually do. More often they get, somewhere around the prophets and they say, and they're done, right? But to have somebody read it and have the experience that he has, I mean, not even rabbis have this experience, right? I can't say that I read the Bible and say, this reminds me of where I live, right? Right, which is the experience he has, that these people, these messy families, this one's married to that one and that one's married to someone else, and this one's having a war with that one, and all these kinds. That doesn't sound like my life at all to me when I read that stuff. I have to sort of find the little places, the little things where I can say, when Abraham greets strangers with hospitality, I can pull out the message of hospitality there, right? And that feels like me, and I feel good about that, right? But to read it and sort of the agricultural and pastoral aspect, right? They speak to his life in this small village, and he recognizes, and that's something that he says, that's me. I've got to find that, right? The holiness in my life through this book is great. There's a movie, The Frisco Kid, Gene Wilder. There's a moment he's captured by Native Americans, and he holds up the Torah, this Native American chief, and he says, I have read this book, and then he looks at Gene Wilder and says, didn't understand a word of it. Right, and that's the more common experience, I think, right, than the experience of reading it and saying, I'm in it. Right? Yeah, Mary.
Are you sitting down? Oh, okay.
It was also my understanding, which I thought was amazing, that when he found the trunk, he found the Bible in the trunk, that it was illegal to have a Bible at that time.
Yeah.
Was that
if not illegal, then certainly frowned on. I mean, I think that's the line. If I remember, a Bible in one's home was not illegal, but it was an act of arrogance. It was heresy, a sign of audacity or insanity, right?
It's a sign of education.
Maybe. I mean, that's not what she says, but right. Right. So the Peruvian Catholic experience, right, would have been hearing the Bible read in Latin, right, and not understanding a word of it. Right?
I thought the ones that having the Bible in Spanish, which is what his
Right.
father had, was illegal, not necessarily.
There was a time when it was illegal, but at the moment that he finds it, I think it's not illegal, right? Okay. There's this the opening chapters sort of talk about this moment where Catholicism no longer has a monopoly in Peru, and this is true, I think, in other countries in South America, Latin America as well. That it is, through the diligence of, this first 60 pages. I mean, there's hardly a mention of Judaism anywhere. The only time, I think, in the first 60 pages where we get a mention of Judaism is the author talking about herself, that people recognize her name as being Jewish, and therefore she feels compelled to relate to the Jewish part of her heritage. But in the part of the book that we've read for this week, those 60 pages, like I said, we read Torah, we know what's coming next. We may have this sense in our, well, if he wants to understand this, he's going to have to find a rabbi, That's not in the first 60 pages. We'll get there, But so it's really these evangelical Protestants who come into Peru, often at the risk of their own lives, right? And sort of open up Peru to the possibility that it's not just Catholics, right? And so they're bringing the Protestant Reformation to Peru, And the idea of Luther and the Protestant Reformation and the advent of the printing press is everybody should own a Bible, everybody should read it, and everybody should interpret it for themselves, right? I mean, that's what Luther wants. You know, he may get sidetracked into some other things along the way, but you know, that's his goal, right? So the idea that his Catholic father has a Spanish translation of a Bible is maybe a sign of education, but as the author says, perhaps something else, you know, audacity.
Who would have the Bible that the Jews had in the same Bible that the Catholics had their version of the Bible? I mean, that to me, where does it come from? Some
Well, actually, I would say a lot of Bibles are printed as Old Testament and New Testament in the same volume. Yeah. 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 You know, I mean, you could certainly find one that didn't have that, but the idea that it would have both. And this is the story of the Abayudaya in Africa. If you know that, this is a group of Jews in Uganda, in modern day Uganda, who in the 19th century, missionaries come, and the chief in the village does exactly that thing. I have read this book, right? I like the first half, right? And converts his tribe to Judaism, right? And they're very much like this group in the sense that they don't claim, you know, it's not like the Ethiopian Jews who have a connection to ancient Israel. They are Jews from thousands of years ago. They develop along their own path in Ethiopia, but they have a connection. Or even there are Jews in places like Madagascar, you know, that are kind of tribal things, but they trace their roots back to Judaism in the Middle East. The Abayudaya in Uganda don't. They're 19th century. They're a 19th century phenomena that continues into the present moment. There is actually a rabbinic student at the Hebrew Union College right now. She's in her 4th year of rabbinic school from Uganda, from the Abayudaya. She's the first American trained rabbinic student, you know, in their community. So, this idea that we don't have Jewish roots, but we connect to the words of Bible. That's this story. You want to say something, Andy?
Reading about them, it just reinforced that I believe that there are certain people that are just born with some deep soul connection, and they know how to follow it, and they're very strong.
Yeah.
And I mean, they're very they really understand where they're going and what's important. And I don't think he's the only one.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's an amazing story, right? And it's and it kind of goes out of its way, the book, to say, you know, he was on a completely different path when he opens up this book, right? I mean, he is looking to avenge his father's murder. You know, it's a whole different, you know, he's in his teens, right, when his father is murdered. He's going to end up in jail for the rest of his life if he goes through with that, most likely, or worse, you know, create this vendetta back and forth where lots of people end up dead. And instead, he picks up this book because it was there, right? And from there, starts on this journey that first takes him to his Catholicism, and then to Seventh-day Adventism, and then leaving that tradition, right? And that's kind of the end of our first 60 pages. You know, where is he going to end up next?
But the journey I didn't find that dramatic or that unusual, because if you look at anybody that seeks a different spiritual meaning or conversion to a religion, what basically the route is, I'm not happy with what I'm doing. I don't feel, in quotation,
it doesn't feel true, right?
Close to God.
Yeah.
So I'm searching.
Yeah.
So whether it's him, those steps, or again, because of my daughter and researching different things, you start finding out that there's all kinds of conversions.
Yeah.
You know, Christians to Judaism, Judaisms to Christians, blacks to And they all have, and if you start listening to them and reading some of their stories, they all have the same thing that he has.
Yeah.
I'm uncomfortable with what I'm doing now, and I'm gonna search for something else.
I think that's pretty fair. There's all kinds of conversions too, so not just the what the rituals actually are and things like that. Sort of, for most of us, the classic story of conversion is someone converts in order to get married, right? This is obviously less a thing today in the Jewish community than it was in the past, but that was sort of the typical thing. And then as a rabbi, it's my goal to find out that those people who are interested in converting to get married are sincere, right? That this is something that they have in their heart, that it's not just something they're doing, for somebody's grandma or whatever, that they want it. So that's sort of what trying to find, but that's usually how people find their way. The more unusual story is the story like this, where you have someone who, all their life felt like, I didn't really fit in that faith that I was born into, right? Or at a later point in their life, maybe they have some reason that they actually rejected what they were born into. I've had people over the years say to me, I like the church I grew up in, but that Jesus thing, it just never connected, right? For me, it was just hard for them, and they didn't know anything else, so they stuck with what they knew up to a certain point, right? And then at a certain point in life, they went to college, maybe they met somebody Jewish, and there's a whole new world, right? It's not about love and marriage. It's about, there's this whole new world of, this isn't the only way to have faith in the world, right? And so, but I would say it's still fairly unusual to find someone who has never met a Jewish person in his life, right? And starts down this path. Is a little unusual. Maybe more than a little, and when you add in the sort of the remote village surroundings that he's in, wow, that's the force of will that it takes to stick with this, is pretty extraordinary.
I think he was searching for a different religion.
Yeah.
What struck me unusual.
Yeah.
If he hadn't found that Bible, was he really looking for another?
No.
faith? It was just the serendipity of that trigger event.
Yeah. And then he reads the book and says, hey, you know what? These Catholics I'm hanging around with, they have idols. Right? Now we would not necessarily think about, we don't think of Catholics as being idols, but if you, okay, all right. I don't. I get, I guess I'd say I'd be more careful with the language than that. But, here he says, for what, if not idols, were the images of saints, the statues of the Virgin and the Lord of Miracles used in processions, right? Some people think the Torah is an idol too. The Torah itself, the way we behave toward it, bowing to it and things, kissing it as it goes around the sanctuary. So there are some, we should be careful. It's not from our tradition, but people who live in glass houses, right? So we should be careful.
Is that that there wasn't something somewhere that they haven't figured out
that somewhere he had Jewish roots that he didn't know about? Yeah, I think that's a proven fact. As much as we can prove anything, right? I can only go back as far as my great grandfather. I can't prove anything before that. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That happens too.
So we just have this, and not only does he start, reading the Bible and therefore becoming dissatisfied with Catholicism, he also starts to develop this connection with a place called Israel before he even really knows that there is one, right? That there's a modern state called Israel. He's reading, says, I will appoint a place for my people and will plant them that they may dwell in a place of their own and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time. Right.
They didn't even know where it was.
Right. Or that it existed. Right. He's he's looking for his own version of the promised land.
Right. He questions about, name Israel and the people Israel.
Mhm.
There was a discussion of, how that happened and came about.
So, everything going okay?
Yeah, I'm just checking in about lunch. There was plenty.
That was great.
Yeah, good. Good, yeah, we're,
Find
More
someone
than
to
enough.
fix the food.
Yeah.
I was afraid of that.
yeah,
Or get it in the fridge.
well, I haven't eaten yet, so
Okay,
I'm
okay,
not
that's
gonna
good.
eat all of that, but I'll say
If
one,
Jay were here.
yeah, right. He'll probably
No,
be, he'll probably be in a little later, and I don't know, has the staff all eaten
no,
and stuff?
we'll
Yeah,
come back.
okay.
We'll come back. I just wanted to check in and
Mhm.
did the Zoom people, everybody on?
I think So,
Okay,
I hope I've done the recording properly, but
I'll let
I'm recording, so
I'll let you know
that
about
part's
that.
good.
So if you
So-
want to look back at it, that'll be on our YouTube channel. You just go to YouTube, Mochkofskyby Lakeside, and you can see a lot of interesting programs.
You have a mic that could be hooked up to the laptop so that people on Zoom can hear us talking in the center.
So that would be the
The
owl.
owl.
We can try that.
We can try it.
Folks are saying that they have been able to hear, and I've been turning
Yeah.
computer, but let's see. Because the owl is a very imperfect beast that we have.
Gives
So,
me nausea.
yeah, but we can give that
Okay.
a try.
Great.
Um,
Thank you.
So his reading leads him away from Catholicism and towards the Seventh-day Adventists, primarily because they celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, right? Which again, it comes from his reading of the Bible, right? So again, it doesn't yet take him to Judaism, but he sees it as a step. Oh, here are some Christians who celebrate, at least they celebrate on the right day. And then you can read that there's actually a split within the group of the Seventh-day Adventists themselves. And ultimately he ends up not particularly welcome there, right? And so he's sort of cast out of the Seventh-day Adventist community because he's too he asks questions, right? I can say it's very Jewish to ask questions, on the other hand, I would say every institution, really, does that person have to ask that many questions? So there's always kind of there's a line, right? And he clearly, is an agitator, right? So, yeah.
To your point, it's very universal. It's a universal story that I'm glad that I didn't know. It's like going to Paraguay, and it's not necessarily strictly based around faith and a journey for faith, but just towards universality in terms of I think on our journey there's changes and there's opportunities, maybe a Bible present, and we're gonna explore that. But I know when I was adopting my son from Paraguay and was given the opportunity to go to Paraguay and to learn about Paraguay, it was through a Jewish adoption organization, and babies became available in Paraguay.
When did you adopt?
I adopted,
What year?
29 years ago, 30 years
So
ago.
that would be, we were 35 years ago, so because at the time that we were doing it, there was no Jewish organization. There weren't even Christian organizations that were in Paraguay. We found a private organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no religious affiliations whatsoever.
No, but the Jewish organization that we were a member of connected us with the private organization or whatever, and said there are babies available in Paraguay. And I said, where's Paraguay? So I had the opportunity to travel to Paraguay. We did our birthright trip back to Paraguay, connected with Argentinian family in Buenos Aires, went into a store in there, right?
All right, well, yeah, you guys should maybe talk offline and compare your experience. But just to finish up, because we're about done for today, but this connection to the Seventh-day Adventists gives him a connection to these Sabbath Bible lessons. And so for the first time, he's not just reading the Bible, but he's getting connected to a larger world of Bible study, which leads him to go into a bookstore and get an encyclopedia and start reading about Mesopotamian antiquity, right? With and then so our section ends here with his disagreements with the Seventh-day Adventist community. It says they have differences among themselves. Once they've settled their differences, maybe we'll find our way back in. But in the meantime, he tells his people that he's already building this tribe, if you like. His salvation mattered more, he told them, and he left with Segundo and the others, right? So their personal goal of personal salvation through the Bible, it's amazing. Soon they would be without their beloved publication, the Bible studies that they were getting, because only members of the church received it. They were alone. So that's how this first section ends on page 61, is right, with a good sort of cliffhanger. Where are they going to go next? And next week we'll find out. So, so if you haven't read up till about, what did I say, 120, 128? And, feel free to not read. If you don't want to read, we'll discuss it, right? So, great. Thank you for coming. Thanks for being here. Very interesting to hear all the connections. Didn't know that was going to happen. So that's pretty cool.
No, this thing is.
Yeah. Yeah, often we bought copies. I didn't do that this time.
It's definitely in the public library, because that's where that's from.
Okay, so
What library?
public library,
Well-
but you have it checked out.
Well, no, but there's lots of libraries with copies, so if you go
Yeah.
into your local library, they can request it,
Yeah.
and they'll bring it to, bring it to your local library.
Thanks. Nice to see you.
Did you know?
This is
Julius
not in high
Lester?
demand, I can tell you that.
I know him a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he died.
It's not like
Yeah.
a New York Times bestseller.
I will never forget hearing it. And Mike,
Yeah.
everyone was with us. Everyone was.
Thank you, everybody.
And anyway,
Yeah.
I can think about him in this
Mark
sense,
Brenner.
because his experience, he fell off on, his father was a pastor, everybody
Right.
was Christian.
Yeah.
Right.
And-
Small world.
Yeah, he's a good example of another person like this sort of autodidact,
Just-
but he comes at least from a religious background, which, so he is, like, I think you were saying, someone who's searching
Yeah.
for the religion that speaks to him. This guy wasn't searching for a religion to speak to him. He just, it falls on his head,
Yeah, anyway, okay, thank you.
Peregrine.
So Northwest